The email landed in my inbox at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly projections in my Chicago apartment. Effective immediately, your employment with Sterling Manufacturing has been terminated. Please return all company property by the end of business today. Do not report to the office. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. No explanation. No phone call. No meeting. Just 23 words that erased 3 years of my life and apparently meant nothing to the company I had literally saved from financial ruin just 48 hours earlier. My name is Sophia Williams. And at 28 years old, I had just pulled off what industry analysts were calling the most brilliant corporate turnaround in manufacturing history. Sterling Manufacturing, a century-old industrial equipment company based in Detroit, had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months. We were 60 days away from Chapter 11 bankruptcy when I presented a restructuring plan that not only saved the company but positioned us to acquire our biggest competitor. The plan worked. The board approved it unanimously. The banks reinstated our credit lines. Our stock price jumped 40% in 2 days, and then they fired me via email. But let me back up, because understanding how we got here requires knowing where I came from and why saving Sterling meant everything to me. I grew up in Flint, Michigan, where my father worked at the General Motors assembly plant for 37 years until it closed in 2019. My mother cleaned office buildings downtown, working 3 different contracts just to keep our lights on. Neither of them finished high school, but they understood something about work that I carry with me everywhere. When something needs fixing, you don't complain about it being broken, you roll up your sleeves and fix it. The Williams family didn't have connections or inherited wealth or trust funds. What we had was a belief that if you worked harder and smarter than everyone else, eventually someone would notice and give you a chance to prove yourself. My parents sacrificed everything to send me to Michigan State, where I studied industrial engineering and finance, graduating summa cum laude with a double major and enough student loan debt to buy a small house. Sterling Manufacturing recruited me straight out of college, impressed by my senior thesis on lean manufacturing optimization in legacy industrial companies. They offered me a position as a junior financial analyst in their corporate restructuring division, which sounded impressive until I realized I was basically the person who analyzed which departments to cut when money got tight. Detroit in 2021 was a city rebuilding itself, full of old industrial giants trying to adapt to modern markets and young professionals who believed they could help bridge that gap. Sterling's headquarters sat in the heart of downtown, a towering glass and steel monument to American manufacturing that had employed thousands of people for generations. Walking into that building every morning felt like stepping into history. My supervisor was Catherine Brooks, a 15-year veteran of corporate finance who had seen Sterling weather multiple recessions, union strikes, and market shifts. Catherine was tough but fair, and she saw something in me that I didn't recognize. Yet, within 6 months, she was giving me projects that should have gone to analysts with 5 years more experience. Sterling manufactured heavy industrial equipment, conveyor systems, automated assembly line components, and custom machinery for factories across North America. It was the kind of business that most people never think about but that keeps the entire economy running smoothly. When a car manufacturer needed to retool their production line, they called Sterling. When a food processing plant needed custom packaging equipment, Sterling built it for them. The company had thrived for decades by being reliable, innovative, and responsive to customer needs. But by 2021, everything was changing. Chinese manufacturers were undercutting our prices on standard equipment. European companies were developing more sophisticated automation technology. Younger competitors were leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning to optimize manufacturing processes in ways Sterling had never considered. Our CEO, Robert Garrison, was 62 years old and had been with the company for 34 years. He understood manufacturing inside and out, but he was struggling to adapt to an industry that was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. The company's approach to challenges was methodical and conservative, which had served them well for generations but was proving inadequate for the current crisis. The first signs of serious trouble emerged in late 2021 when Sterling lost 3 major contracts to overseas competitors in the same month. Our profit margins were shrinking, our debt service was consuming an increasingly large percentage of revenue, and our technology infrastructure was at least 5 years behind industry standards. By early 2022, the situation had become critical. Sterling was burning through cash reserves at an unsustainable rate, our credit rating had been downgraded twice, and several key clients were demanding contract renegotiations with lower prices and faster delivery schedules. The board of directors Was meeting weekly to discuss cost-cutting measures and potential strategic alternatives. That's when Catherine Brooks pulled me into her office and changed the trajectory of my career forever. She explained that Robert Garrison had asked the restructuring division to develop a comprehensive analysis of Sterling's financial position and strategic options. The analysis would be presented to the board and would likely determine whether the company could survive independently or would need to be sold or liquidated. "Sophia," she said, "I know you've only been here 18 months, but your work on the efficiency optimization project last quarter was exceptional. I want you to lead this analysis. I'm talking about complete access to every department, every contract, every financial record. This isn't about cutting costs around the margins. This is about reimagining what Sterling Manufacturing could become." The opportunity was both thrilling and terrifying. Leading a company-wide strategic analysis at 26 years old was the kind of responsibility that could launch a career or destroy it completely. Success would establish me as a rising star in corporate finance. Failure would mean that hundreds of families would lose their jobs and a century-old company would disappear. Forever. I accepted immediately. The next 4 months were the most intense period of my professional life. I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, diving deeper into Sterling's operations than anyone had ever attempted. I analyzed 5 years of financial statements, interviewed department heads across the company, studied our competitors' strategies, and researched emerging technologies that could revolutionize industrial manufacturing. What I discovered was both worse and better than anyone had realized. Sterling's financial situation was more precarious than the board understood. We had perhaps 90 days of operating capital remaining, and our debt obligations were structured in a way that would trigger accelerated repayment clauses if we missed any quarterly targets. But I also discovered something remarkable. Sterling had intellectual property and manufacturing capabilities that our competitors would pay enormous sums to acquire. Our engineering team had developed proprietary automation software that was years ahead of anything else in the market. Our facility in Ohio had production capacity that was being utilized at only 60% efficiency. Most importantly, our reputation for reliability and custom solutions had created customer relationships that represented tremendous long-term value. The problem wasn't that Sterling was fundamentally broken. The problem was that we were organized and operated like a 20th century company trying to compete in a 21st century market. We needed to restructure everything: our debt, our operations, our technology infrastructure, and our strategic focus. I spent weeks developing a comprehensive turnaround plan that would transform Sterling from a traditional manufacturing company into a technology-enabled industrial solutions provider. The plan called for consolidating our production facilities, investing heavily in automation and artificial intelligence, restructuring our debt obligations, and repositioning ourselves to serve high-growth industries like renewable energy and electric vehicle manufacturing. The financial projections were stunning. If executed properly, the plan would not only save Sterling but position us to double our revenue within 3 years and potentially acquire smaller competitors who couldn't adapt to the changing market. Catherine Brooks reviewed my analysis and called it the most sophisticated strategic planning work she had seen in her 15-year career. Robert Garrison spent 2 weeks studying every detail and pronounced it brilliant but aggressive. The board of directors scheduled a special meeting to hear my presentation. Standing in that boardroom, looking at 12 of Detroit's most experienced business leaders, I felt the weight of everyone's expectations. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. Every recommendation I made would affect real people's lives: the factory workers who built our equipment, the engineers who designed it, the sales teams who sold it, and the thousands of customers who depended on our products. The presentation went perfectly. I walked through every aspect of the analysis, answered every question, and addressed every concern. When I finished, the room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then board chairman David Mitchell stood up and said, "Sophia, in 40 years of business, I have never seen such comprehensive and insightful strategic analysis from someone your age. This plan doesn't just save Sterling Manufacturing. It transforms us into the company we should have been all along." The board voted unanimously to approve the restructuring plan. Within 24 hours, Sterling's stock price had surged. Our credit rating was under review for potential upgrade, and industry publications were calling our turnaround strategy a model for legacy manufacturing companies across the country. I went home that night feeling like I had accomplished something that would define my entire career. I had saved Sterling Manufacturing and proven that hard work, intelligence, and determination could triumph over any challenge. 48 hours later, I was fired via email. To understand why my termination was so shocking, you need to know exactly what Sterling Manufacturing was facing when I first walked into that boardroom 6 months earlier. The crisis wasn't just about declining profits or market pressure. We were staring at complete corporate collapse. The manufacturing industry in 2022 was experiencing the most dramatic transformation since the Industrial Revolution. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and advanced materials science were reshaping everything from production processes to supply chain management. Companies that had dominated for decades were disappearing overnight, unable to adapt fast enough to survive. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Sterling's problems went deeper than anyone in senior management wanted to admit. Our flagship product line, heavy-duty conveyor systems, was being undercut by Chinese manufacturers offering similar equipment at 40% lower prices. Our custom automation solutions required installation times that averaged 3 months, while newer competitors were delivering fully integrated systems in 6 weeks. The financial metrics told a devastating story. In 2021, Sterling had reported revenues of $485 million, down from $627 million just 2 years earlier. Our gross profit margins had shrunk from 24% to 11% as we slashed prices to retain customers. More critically, our debt-to-equity ratio had climbed to 3.2:1, meaning we owed more than $3 for every dollar of company value. Cash flow was the immediate threat. Sterling was burning through approximately $12 million per month in operating expenses while generating only $8 million in monthly revenue. Simple mathematics showed we had perhaps 10 weeks of operation remaining before we'd be unable to meet payroll or service our debt obligations. The banking consortium led by First National Detroit had already placed Sterling on a watch list for potential default. Our primary credit facility carried covenants requiring minimum quarterly earnings and maximum debt ratios. Missing any of those targets would trigger immediate repayment of $67 million in outstanding loans. Money Sterling simply didn't have. Robert Garrison called an emergency meeting of the senior leadership team on a gray February morning. The conference room on the 15th floor offered a panoramic view of Detroit's downtown, but nobody was admiring the scenery. Around the table sat 8 executives who had collectively spent over 2 centuries building Sterling into an industry leader, and they were all facing the possibility that their life's work was about to vanish. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, "our auditors have completed their quarterly review. Unless we can fundamentally alter our financial trajectory within 60 days, Sterling Manufacturing will be forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection." The silence that followed was profound. These weren't people accustomed to failure. Chief Operating Officer Jennifer Hayes had overseen Sterling's expansion into automated assembly systems. Chief Technology Officer Brandon Reed held 17 patents in industrial automation. Chief Financial Officer Donald Porter had guided the company through 2 previous recessions and emerged stronger both times, but this crisis was different. It wasn't cyclical economic pressure or temporary market disruption. Sterling was facing existential obsolescence, and everyone in that room knew it. Donald Porter opened a thick folder of financial documents. "The numbers are stark," he said. "We're facing $23 million in debt service over the next 90 days. Our accounts receivable are stretched to 87 days average collection, meaning customers are taking nearly 3 months to pay invoices. Meanwhile, our suppliers are demanding cash on delivery for critical components." Jennifer Hayes leaned forward. "It's not just the financials," she said. "We've lost credibility in the market. When Consolidated Automotive canceled their $34 million order last month, it wasn't just about price competition. They specifically cited concerns about Sterling's long-term viability. Customers don't want to invest in systems from a company that might not exist to service them." The meeting continued for 4 hours as each department head outlined the scope of Sterling's challenges. The engineering division was understaffed and using software that was generations behind industry standards. The manufacturing facilities were operating at 47% capacity because demand had collapsed. The sales team was competing against companies that could offer financing terms Sterling couldn't match. Most troubling was the cascade effect. As Sterling's financial problems became public knowledge, customers were canceling orders, suppliers were tightening payment terms, and the company's best employees were leaving for competitors. Each departure weakened Sterling's capabilities, making it even harder to compete effectively. That's when Catherine Brooks spoke up from her seat near the end of the table. "We need a comprehensive restructuring analysis," she said. "Not just cost-cutting measures or incremental improvements. A complete reimagining of what Sterling Manufacturing could become." Robert Garrison nodded slowly. "How long would such an analysis take?" "Done properly?" "For months minimum," Catherine replied. "But we don't have 4 months. We need recommendations. Within 60 days if we're going to present viable alternatives to the board. The room fell silent again as everyone processed the impossible timeline. A comprehensive corporate restructuring typically required 6 to 12 months of analysis, involving teams of consultants and industry experts. Sterling needed answers in 8 weeks. That afternoon, Catherine called me into her office. The conversation that followed would change everything. "Sophia," she said, closing the door behind us, "I'm going to ask you to do something that's either going to make your career or destroy it completely. There's no middle ground here." She outlined what had been discussed in the morning meeting, emphasizing the urgency and scope of what Sterling needed. Then she made her proposition. "I want you to lead the restructuring analysis. Full access to every department, every contract, every financial record. You'll report directly to me, but you'll have authority to interview anyone in the company and examine any aspect of our operations." I felt my heart rate accelerate. "Catherine, I've been here 18 months. Shouldn't this go to someone with more experience?" She smiled grimly. "Experience with what? Managing corporate failure? The people with more experience are the same. People who got us into this situation. We need fresh thinking, and frankly, we need someone young enough to work 20-hour days for 2 months straight." The challenge was staggering. I would be analyzing a company with 1,847 employees across 4 facilities, examining contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and developing strategic recommendations that could affect thousands of families throughout the Midwest. But something in Catherine's confidence made me believe it was possible. More than that, something about Sterling's crisis connected to my own background in ways I couldn't fully explain. I had grown up watching entire communities devastated when manufacturing jobs disappeared. I understood what was at stake here beyond balance sheets and profit margins. "I'll do it," I said. The next morning, I began what would become the most intensive research project of my life. Catherine had arranged for me to have a temporary office on the executive floor with access to Sterling's complete financial database. She also assigned me 2 junior analysts, Kevin Thompson and Rachel Martinez, both recent graduates eager to prove themselves. My first priority was understanding exactly how Sterling made money and where it lost money. The company's financial statements told one story, but I needed to dig deeper into the operational realities behind those numbers. Sterling's revenue came from 3 primary sources: standard conveyor systems that could be manufactured in volume, custom automation solutions designed for specific customer needs, and ongoing service contracts for equipment maintenance. The service contracts were highly profitable but represented only 18% of total revenue. The custom solutions carried higher margins but required extensive engineering resources and long development cycles. The standard conveyor systems generated the most revenue but faced intense price pressure from overseas competitors. What struck me immediately was how little Sterling understood about its own profitability. The company's cost accounting system allocated overhead expenses based on revenue percentages rather than actual resource consumption. This meant that highly profitable service contracts were being charged with overhead costs that should have been attributed to resource-intensive custom projects. After recalculating Sterling's true profitability by product line, I discovered something remarkable. The service division was generating 47% profit margins, nearly triple what the company's financial statements indicated. Custom automation projects, meanwhile, were actually losing money on average once all development costs were properly allocated. This was crucial information, but it was only the beginning. I needed to understand Sterling's competitive position, market opportunities, and operational capabilities before I could develop meaningful recommendations. I spent 2 weeks interviewing every department head in the company, asking detailed questions about their processes, challenges, and ideas for improvement. The engineering team revealed that they had developed proprietary software for optimizing conveyor belt speeds and maintenance schedules, but Sterling had never commercialized this technology. The manufacturing division had identified numerous efficiency improvements that hadn't been implemented due to capital constraints. Most intriguingly, the sales team had been receiving inquiries from companies in renewable energy and electric vehicle manufacturing, high-growth industries that Sterling had never seriously pursued. These potential customers needed specialized equipment that Sterling's engineering capabilities could absolutely deliver, but the company lacked the industry knowledge and relationships to compete effectively. Kevin Thompson proved invaluable at analyzing Sterling's competitive landscape. He identified 47 companies worldwide that competed in various aspects of Sterling's business, categorizing them by size, capabilities, and market focus. What emerged was a picture of an industry in rapid consolidation, with smaller players being acquired by larger corporations that could offer integrated solutions and global service capabilities. Rachel Martinez focused on emerging technologies and industry trends. Her research revealed that the manufacturing automation market was expected to grow by 12% annually over the next 5 years, driven primarily by labor shortages and the need for higher precision in advanced manufacturing. Companies that could combine traditional mechanical expertise with software intelligence and data analytics were positioned to capture disproportionate value. 3 weeks into the analysis, I had a breakthrough moment while reviewing Sterling's intellectual property portfolio. The company owned patents on 17 different automation technologies, including several that had applications far beyond Sterling's current market focus. More importantly, Sterling's engineering team had developed machine learning algorithms that could predict equipment failures with 94% accuracy, technology that major manufacturers would pay millions to license. This discovery fundamentally changed my perspective on Sterling's crisis. The company wasn't failing because it lacked valuable capabilities. Sterling was failing because it was organized and operated like a traditional manufacturing company when it should have been positioned as a technology and services provider. The solution became clear: instead of competing on price for standard equipment, Sterling should focus on high-value services, technology licensing, and custom solutions for emerging industries. Instead of trying to match Chinese manufacturing costs, Sterling should leverage its engineering expertise and customer relationships to deliver outcomes that price-focused competitors couldn't match. But transforming Sterling's business model would require dramatic changes to every aspect of the company's operations. We would need to restructure our debt, reallocate our workforce, upgrade our technology infrastructure, and fundamentally change how we approach the market. I spent the next 3 weeks developing detailed financial projections for Sterling's transformation. The numbers were striking. By shifting focus to services and technology licensing, Sterling could achieve gross margins of 38% while growing revenue by 15% annually. The restructured company would be profitable within 18 months and could potentially double in value within 3 years. The plan called for closing Sterling's least efficient manufacturing facility while expanding the engineering and software development teams. We would pursue partnerships with companies in renewable energy and electric vehicle manufacturing, offering integrated solutions that combined Sterling's mechanical expertise with advanced data analytics. Most ambitiously, we would spin off Sterling's software capabilities into a separate licensing division that could generate recurring revenue from customers worldwide. Catherine Brooks reviewed my preliminary findings and called them transformational. But the real test would come when I presented the complete analysis to Robert Garrison and the board of directors, standing outside the boardroom on that March morning, holding a presentation that represented 2 months of my life and potentially the future of 1,847 jobs. I felt the weight of everything my parents had sacrificed to give me this opportunity. The girl from Flint was about to tell some of Detroit's most powerful business leaders how to save a century-old company. What I didn't know was that my success would ultimately be used against me in ways I could never have imagined. The boardroom at Sterling Manufacturing was designed to intimidate. Mahogany panels lined the walls, displaying portraits of previous CEOs stretching back to the company's founding in 1923. The oval conference table could seat 20 people, though today only 12 board members were present, along with Robert Garrison and myself. David Mitchell, the board chairman, was a legend in Detroit business circles. He had guided Ford Motor Company through the 2008 financial crisis and served on the boards of 6 major corporations. Sitting to his right was Margaret Coleman, former CEO of General Electric's Industrial Division and one of the most respected women in American manufacturing. These weren't people who impressed easily. I had prepared for this moment obsessively. My presentation consisted of 127 slides, each one backed by data I had personally verified. But numbers alone wouldn't save Sterling. I needed to tell a story that would convince these experienced executives to bet the company's future on a 28-year-old analyst's vision. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. Sterling Manufacturing is not dying. Sterling Manufacturing is being reborn. The opening slide displayed a single number, $2.3 billion. The room stirred slightly as board members leaned forward. That figure represents the market opportunity Sterling is positioned to capture over the next 5 years, I continued. Not in our traditional markets, where we've been competing on price against overseas manufacturers, but in emerging industries, where our engineering expertise and intellectual property create unassailable competitive advantages. I walked them through Sterling's true financial position, starting with the profitability analysis that had shocked even me. The service division, which management had treated as a supporting function, was actually Sterling's most valuable asset. With gross margins of 47% and customer retention rates above 90%, our maintenance contracts represented a gold mine that had been hidden by inadequate cost accounting. More importantly, I said, clicking to the next slide, Sterling owns 17 patents in automation technology, including machine learning algorithms that can predict equipment failures with 94% accuracy. Companies like Tesla and Amazon would pay millions to license this technology, yet we've never commercialized it beyond our own customer base. Margaret Coleman raised her hand. Sophia, these margins seem optimistic. What evidence do you have that industrial customers will pay premium prices for predictive maintenance services? I had anticipated this question. Last month, I conducted informal discussions with procurement managers at 12 major manufacturers. When I described Sterling's predictive capabilities without identifying our company, 11 of them expressed immediate interest in pilot programs. The average budget they mentioned for such services was $480,000 annually per facility. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as board members processed this information. I pressed forward with the strategic transformation plan. Sterling's future wasn't as a traditional manufacturer competing on cost. Our future was as a technology-enabled solutions provider serving high-growth industries. The plan called for restructuring Sterling into 3 integrated divisions: Advanced Manufacturing Solutions, Industrial Intelligence Software, and Global Service Operations. Advanced Manufacturing Solutions would focus exclusively on custom automation projects for renewable energy and electric vehicle manufacturers. These industries required precision equipment that Sterling's engineering team could absolutely deliver, and they paid premium prices for proven reliability. Industrial Intelligence Software would commercialize Sterling's predictive maintenance algorithms, machine learning capabilities, and process optimization tools. Instead of treating software as a supporting function, we would position these technologies as standalone products that could generate recurring license revenue from customers worldwide. Global Service Operations would expand Sterling's maintenance and support capabilities, leveraging our predictive technology to offer guaranteed uptime contracts. Manufacturing companies would pay substantial premiums for contractual guarantees that their production lines would operate without interruption. The financial projections were compelling. Year 1 would focus on restructuring and market positioning, with modest revenue growth of 8%. Year 2 would see the benefits of our new market focus, driving revenue growth to 22% while expanding gross margins to 34%. By year 3, Sterling would be generating $687 million in annual revenue with gross margins exceeding 40%, but the most exciting projection was the valuation impact. Traditional manufacturing companies traded at price-to-earnings ratios between 8 and 12. Technology and services companies commanded ratios between 18 and 25. By repositioning Sterling as a technology provider, we could potentially triple the company's market value even before considering revenue growth. Board member Thomas Richardson, who had built and sold 2 technology companies, leaned back in his chair. This is fascinating, Sophia, but implementation seems extraordinarily complex. How do we manage the transition without destroying our existing business? This was the crux of my plan. The transformation would happen in carefully orchestrated phases designed to minimize disruption while maximizing speed to market. Phase 1 would involve closing Sterling's least efficient manufacturing facility in Cleveland while consolidating production in our Detroit and Ohio locations. The cost savings would fund investments in software development and engineering talent. Simultaneously, we would launch pilot programs with 3 renewable energy companies to demonstrate our capabilities in new markets. Phase 2 would establish Sterling's software licensing division, beginning with our existing customer base before expanding to competitors who needed predictive maintenance capabilities. We would also acquire 2 smaller companies, a data analytics firm in Austin and an industrial IoT startup in Boston. These acquisitions would accelerate our technology development while adding crucial expertise. Phase 3 would scale our new business model globally, establishing service centers in Mexico, Canada, and Germany to support multinational manufacturers. By this point, Sterling would be generating more revenue from software licenses and service contracts than from equipment sales. The debt restructuring component was equally critical. Sterling's existing obligations could be renegotiated based on our improved business model and growth projections. I had preliminary discussions with 3 investment banks about refinancing our debt at lower interest rates while extending repayment terms. The key was demonstrating that Sterling's transformation would generate sufficient cash flow to service restructured obligations. David Mitchell studied the financial projections carefully. Sophia, your analysis suggests Sterling could achieve $687 million in revenue by year 3. That's a 41% increase from our peak performance. What gives you confidence that these projections are achievable? I had spent weeks stress testing every assumption in my financial model. Chairman Mitchell, these projections are actually conservative compared to what comparable companies have achieved. Rockwell Automation transformed from a traditional manufacturer to a technology provider and increased their valuation by 340% over 4 years. Emerson Electric made a similar transition and achieved compound annual growth rates of 18% while expanding margins from 12% to 31%. The presentation continued for 2 hours as I walked through every aspect of Sterling's transformation. Implementation timelines, technology requirements, competitive analysis, risk mitigation strategies, and detailed financial models that projected quarterly results for the next 5 years. When I finished, the boardroom was silent. 12 of Detroit's most experienced business leaders sat quietly, processing a proposal that would fundamentally reshape a century-old company based on the analysis of someone young enough to be their daughter. David Mitchell spoke first. Sophia, in 40 years of business, I have never seen such comprehensive strategic analysis from someone your age. This plan doesn't just save Sterling Manufacturing. It positions us to dominate emerging markets that we've never seriously considered. Margaret Coleman nodded in agreement. The intellectual property assessment alone is worth millions in value creation. But what impresses me most is the implementation strategy. This isn't theoretical consulting work. This is a practical roadmap that addresses every major risk and operational challenge. Thomas Richardson was equally enthusiastic. The market timing is perfect. Renewable energy and electric vehicle manufacturers desperately need the kind of precision automation that Sterling can provide. If we can establish relationships now, before larger competitors recognize the opportunity, we could capture market share that would be impossible to achieve later. The board voted unanimously to approve the strategic transformation plan. More than that, they authorized immediate implementation of Phase 1, including facility consolidation, technology investments, and initial market development activities. Robert Garrison stood up as the meeting concluded. Sophia, you've given Sterling a future that none of us imagined was possible. This company owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. The aftermath of the board meeting was euphoric. Within hours, news of Sterling's strategic transformation had leaked to industry publications. Manufacturing Today ran a story titled, "Sterling's Bold Bet on Technology." The Detroit Free Press published an article about young professionals revitalizing legacy industrial companies. By the end of the week, Sterling's stock price had increased 34%. More importantly, customers and partners were responding positively to our new strategic direction. 3 renewable energy companies requested meetings to discuss potential automation projects. 2 major automotive manufacturers inquired about licensing Sterling's predictive maintenance software. Investment banks that had been avoiding Sterling's calls were suddenly eager to discuss refinancing opportunities. Catherine Brooks pulled me aside the day after the board presentation. Sophia, I've worked in corporate finance for 15 years. And I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished. You didn't just analyze Sterling's problems. You reimagined what this company could become. The recognition felt overwhelming. I had spent 2 months working 18-hour days, sacrificing sleep and social connections to develop a plan that might save Sterling Manufacturing. Now that plan was being implemented, and everyone from board members to industry analysts was calling it brilliant. Robert Garrison scheduled a company-wide meeting to announce Sterling's strategic transformation. Standing before 1,847 employees in the main manufacturing facility, he outlined the new vision while crediting my analysis as the foundation for Sterling's future success. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the factory floor, "Sterling Manufacturing is embarking on the most ambitious transformation in our company's history. Thanks to the exceptional work of our strategic planning team, led by Sophia Williams, we're positioned not just to survive but to thrive in markets we've never served before." The applause was thunderous. Workers who had been worried about layoffs were suddenly excited about new opportunities. Engineers who had felt undervalued were eager to contribute to cutting-edge projects. Sales representatives who had struggled to compete on price were enthusiastic about selling premium solutions. I felt a sense of accomplishment that was deeper than professional satisfaction. This wasn't just about saving my own career or proving my capabilities. Sterling Manufacturing employed nearly 2,000 people whose families depended on the company's success. My analysis hadn't just created shareholder value. It had preserved livelihoods and communities throughout the Midwest. The weeks following the board presentation passed in a blur of implementation activities. Sterling's legal team was negotiating facility closures and asset transfers. The engineering division was recruiting software developers and data scientists. The sales team was developing proposals for renewable energy companies that had never considered Sterling as a potential partner. My role expanded dramatically as Robert Garrison asked me to oversee the strategic transformation implementation. Catherine Brooks was promoted to Chief Financial Officer, and I assumed her previous responsibilities while also managing the new initiatives that were emerging from my original analysis. The additional responsibility was demanding but exhilarating. I was attending meetings with senior executives, making decisions that affected millions of dollars in investments, and working directly with board members on strategic planning initiatives. At 28 years old, I was functioning as a de facto chief strategy officer for a major manufacturing company. The success was intoxicating, but it was also isolating. Most of my colleagues were supportive, but there was an undercurrent of resentment from some senior managers who felt that a junior analyst had leapfrogged over people with decades more experience. I tried to be gracious about the recognition while acknowledging everyone who had contributed to Sterling's transformation plan. 3 months after the board presentation, Sterling announced its first major contract win in the renewable energy sector, a $47 million agreement to provide custom automation equipment for a wind turbine manufacturing facility in Texas. The contract validated everything I had predicted about Sterling's potential in emerging markets. The success created momentum that seemed unstoppable. Sterling's stock price had increased 67% since my board presentation. Credit rating agencies were reviewing our debt for potential upgrades. Industry publications were featuring Sterling as a case study in successful corporate transformation. Robert Garrison called me into his office on a Friday afternoon in late June. The conversation that followed seemed routine at the time, but looking back, I recognize it as the moment when everything began to change. "Sophia," he said, settling behind his desk with an expression I couldn't quite read, "you've been working incredibly hard for months. The board and I are concerned that you're pushing yourself beyond sustainable limits. Why don't you take a long weekend? Maybe even a full week? You've more than earned some time away from the office." At the time, his concern seemed genuine and thoughtful. I had been working 70-hour weeks since February, and I was exhausted. A few days of rest seemed like exactly what I needed to recharge before Sterling's next phase of growth. "That sounds wonderful," I replied. "I was thinking about visiting my parents in Flint. I haven't seen them since the board presentation, and they're eager to hear about everything that's been happening." Robert smiled warmly. "Perfect. Take care of yourself, Sophia. Sterling needs you at your best for the challenges ahead." I left the office that evening feeling grateful for Robert's consideration and excited about spending time with my family. My parents had been following Sterling's transformation through local news coverage, and they were proud beyond words that their daughter had played such a crucial role in saving the company. What I didn't know was that my well-deserved rest was actually strategic timing for events that would destroy everything I had worked to build. While I was away from the office, celebrating with my family and believing that my hard work had been recognized and rewarded, Robert Garrison was implementing plans that would eliminate me from Sterling's future entirely. The girl from Flint, who had saved a century-old company, was about to learn that corporate gratitude had limits, and that sometimes success makes you more dangerous than failure ever could. The termination email arrived while I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table, the same table where I had done homework as a child and studied for my engineering exams in college. My mother was making pancakes for breakfast, humming softly while she worked. My father was reading the Detroit Free Press, occasionally pointing out articles about Sterling's transformation success to anyone who would listen. "Sophia, honey, there's another article about your company in the business section," he said proudly. "Says Sterling Manufacturing is leading a revolution in American industrial technology." I smiled and reached for my phone to share the article on social media. That's when I saw the email from Robert Garrison with the subject line, "Employment termination, immediate." My stomach dropped as I read those 23 words that destroyed everything I had built. "What's wrong?" my mother asked, noticing the color drain from my face. I couldn't speak. I read the email 3 more times, hoping I had misunderstood something, but the message was brutally clear. My employment had been terminated effective immediately. I was forbidden from entering Sterling's facilities. Security would collect my company property. "Sophia?" My father's voice seemed to come from very far away. "I've been fired," I whispered. The next few hours passed in a surreal haze. My parents were confused and angry, demanding explanations I couldn't provide. I called Catherine Brooks immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I tried reaching Kevin Thompson and Rachel Martinez, my team members from the restructuring analysis, but neither answered their phones. Finally, I called Sterling's main reception number. The woman who answered was someone I didn't recognize. "I'm sorry, Ms. Williams," she said after I identified myself, "but I've been instructed to refer all inquiries about your employment status to Human Resources." They'll be in touch regarding the return of company property. Company property. As if 3 years of my life could be reduced to a laptop and an access badge. I drove back to Chicago that afternoon in complete shock. The same route I had traveled countless times with excitement and anticipation now felt like a funeral procession. Every mile took me further from the life I had built and the career I had thought was just beginning to flourish. My apartment felt foreign and unwelcoming. The walls were covered with framed articles about Sterling's transformation, photos from company events, and certificates recognizing my academic achievements. All of it seemed to mock me now. The girl who had saved Sterling Manufacturing wasn't even worthy of a phone call to explain her termination. That evening, I forced myself to review everything that had happened over the past week, searching for clues about what might have triggered my dismissal. Robert Garrison had seemed genuinely pleased with my work. The board had unanimously approved my strategic plan. Sterling's stock price was at a 3-year high. None of it made sense. I spent the night staring at my ceiling, alternating between rage and despair. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' confused faces when I told them I had been fired. I thought about Catherine Brooks, who had given me the opportunity that launched my career. I thought about the 1,847 Sterling employees who had applauded when Robert Garrison credited my work with saving their jobs. Most painfully, I thought about all the young women from working-class backgrounds who looked up to my story as proof that hard work and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. What would they think when they learned that corporate success was apparently no protection against arbitrary termination? The next morning brought a call from Human Resources representative Linda Patterson, whose voice carried all the warmth of an automated phone system. Ms. Williams, we need to arrange the return of Sterling Manufacturing property in your possession. A courier will arrive at your apartment this afternoon to collect your laptop, access badge, and any company documents. Linda, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, can you explain why my employment was terminated? I haven't received any explanation beyond a brief email. I'm not authorized to discuss the specifics of employment decisions, she replied. However, I can confirm that your termination was related to performance issues and failure to meet company standards. Performance issues. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had saved Sterling from bankruptcy. I had developed a strategic plan that increased the company's value by hundreds of millions of dollars. I had worked 18-hour days for months to ensure Sterling's transformation succeeded. And now they were claiming performance issues. What specific performance issues? I demanded. I'm sorry, but I can't discuss personnel matters in detail. The courier will arrive between 2 and 4 p.m. today. Please have all company property ready for collection. She hung up before I could respond. The courier arrived at 3:17 p.m. He was a young man who seemed embarrassed by his assignment, particularly when he saw the tears in my eyes as I handed over the laptop that contained months of my work. I'm really sorry about this, he said quietly. My girlfriend works at Sterling. She says you're the person who saved everyone's jobs. After he left, I sat in my empty apartment and tried to process what had happened. 3 days ago, I had been Sterling's rising star, personally credited by the CEO for the company's strategic transformation. Now I was unemployed, banned from the premises, and accused of performance failures. The professional isolation was devastating, but the personal betrayal was worse. I had trusted Robert Garrison. I had believed that exceptional work would be recognized and rewarded. I had assumed that saving a company from bankruptcy would create job security, not termination. Over the next few days, I tried reaching out to former colleagues for information about what had happened. Most of them didn't return my calls. The few who did speak with me seemed nervous and reluctant to discuss Sterling's internal operations. Rachel Martinez was the exception. She called me 3 days after my termination, speaking in hushed tones as if she was afraid of being overheard. Sophia, I can't talk long, but I need you to know that everyone is confused about what happened. Kevin and I have been asking questions, but we're being told that it's not appropriate to discuss personnel decisions. Rachel, has anything changed with the strategic plan implementation? There was a long pause. That's the thing, Sophia. Nothing has changed. We're still moving forward with everything you recommended. The facility closure, the technology investments, the renewable energy contracts. It's like they terminated you but kept all your work. That information was somehow both comforting and infuriating. Sterling was implementing my strategic plan while claiming I had performance issues. They were using my analysis to transform the company while erasing my involvement from the official narrative. There's something else, Rachel continued. Robert Garrison announced yesterday that he's promoting Brian Kellerman to Chief Strategy Officer. Brian is taking credit for the transformation plan, saying he's been developing these ideas for over a year. Brian Kellerman. I knew him as a mid-level manager in business development who had contributed almost nothing to Sterling's restructuring analysis. He was personable and politically connected within the company, but his strategic thinking was conventional at best. The idea that he had developed Sterling's transformation plan was absurd, but apparently, absurdity was no obstacle to corporate revisionist history. The betrayal became clearer over the following week as I pieced together information from various sources. Robert Garrison had apparently decided that crediting a junior analyst with saving Sterling diminished his own leadership reputation. The board might have approved my plan, but Garrison wanted the transformation to be remembered as his strategic vision. Promoting Brian Kellerman allowed Garrison to maintain the fiction that senior leadership had developed Sterling's new direction. My termination eliminated the inconvenient truth that a 28-year-old had outperformed executives with decades of experience. The calculation was cynical but effective. Sterling kept all the benefits of my analysis while erasing my contribution from the company's official narrative. They avoided the embarrassment of admitting that junior staff had solved problems that senior management couldn't address. What they hadn't anticipated was how my termination would be perceived outside Sterling's walls. Catherine Brooks was the first to reach out with information about the broader reaction to my firing. She called me 2 weeks after my termination, her voice tight with anger. "Sophia, I need you to know that several board members are asking serious questions about your termination. David Mitchell specifically wants to understand why the person who developed our strategic plan is no longer with the company." This was encouraging, but Catherine's next words were sobering. "However, Robert has been very effective at framing your dismissal as a personnel matter that the board shouldn't second-guess. He's emphasizing your age and experience level, suggesting that you were overwhelmed by the responsibilities and couldn't handle the pressure of implementation." The lies were becoming more sophisticated. Garrison was using my youth against me, implying that I had cracked under pressure despite having delivered exactly what the board had requested. "Catherine, is there anything I can do? Any way to challenge this?" She sighed deeply. "Legally, Michigan is an at-will employment state. Sterling can terminate anyone for any reason as long as it's not discriminatory. And unfortunately, age discrimination laws only protect workers over 40. The legal reality was as brutal as the corporate politics. I had no recourse against Sterling's decision, regardless of how unjust or irrational it seemed, but Catherine had more information that would prove crucial in the coming weeks. "Sophia, there's something else you should know. I've been reviewing the implementation of your strategic plan, and I've noticed some concerning changes. The renewable energy contracts you identified are being pursued, but the terms are significantly different from what you recommended." "Different how?" "Brian Kellerman is negotiating much more aggressive pricing, apparently trying to accelerate deal closure. Your analysis emphasized premium pricing based on Sterling's superior technology and service capabilities. Brian is competing primarily on cost, which undermines the entire strategic positioning." This was exactly what I had feared. Sterling's transformation plan wasn't just about entering new markets. It was about fundamentally changing how the company competed, moving from price-based competition to value-based differentiation. If Brian was reverting to cost competition, he was destroying the foundation of Sterling's strategic advantage. "More concerning," Catherine continued, "is what's happening with the intellectual property commercialization. Your plan called for careful licensing of Sterling's software capabilities to maximize long-term revenue. Brian is pushing for immediate licensing deals with minimal royalty terms, apparently trying to generate quick cash flow." The implications were staggering. Sterling's intellectual property was potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing revenue over the next decade. Rushing into poorly structured deals for short-term cash would sacrifice enormous long-term value. I realized that my termination wasn't just personal betrayal. It was potentially corporate sabotage. By removing me and installing someone who didn't understand the strategic plan's underlying logic, Sterling was jeopardizing everything we had worked to achieve. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't challenge my termination through legal channels, and I couldn't rely on internal corporate politics to restore my position. But I could ensure that Sterling's strategic plan was implemented correctly, even if the company refused to acknowledge my role in developing it. I began documenting everything I knew about Sterling's transformation plan, including the specific assumptions, calculations, and strategic logic that Brian Kellerman apparently didn't understand. If Sterling was going to benefit from my work, they were going to implement it correctly. What I discovered during this documentation process would expose corruption that made my termination seem insignificant by comparison. 3 weeks after my firing, while reviewing Sterling's public financial filings to understand how the transformation was being communicated to investors, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Sterling had announced a new partnership agreement with a company called Meridian Industrial Solutions, describing it as a strategic collaboration to accelerate market penetration in renewable energy sectors. The announcement emphasized substantial upfront payments from Meridian in exchange for exclusive licensing rights to Sterling's predictive maintenance software. The problem was that Meridian Industrial Solutions didn't exist 3 months ago. I had analyzed every significant player in the industrial automation market during my restructuring research, and Meridian had never appeared in any industry database or trade publication. More troubling, the licensing terms described in Sterling's announcement were exactly the kind of poor deal structure that Catherine had warned me about. Sterling was giving away potentially valuable intellectual property for immediate cash payments instead of building long-term royalty revenue. I spent the next 2 days researching Meridian Industrial Solutions through every public database I could access. What I found was deeply disturbing. Meridian had been incorporated in Delaware just 6 weeks ago. The company had no operational facilities, no employees besides its 3 corporate officers, and no business history in industrial automation. Most significantly, Meridian's registered address was a law firm that specialized in corporate shell companies and asset protection strategies. Sterling Manufacturing was licensing valuable intellectual property to a company that appeared to exist solely on paper, in exchange for cash payments that would primarily benefit senior management through performance bonuses tied to short-term revenue targets. Robert Garrison hadn't just stolen credit for my work. He was potentially stealing the company itself. Sitting in my Chicago apartment, surrounded by evidence of what might be massive corporate fraud, I realized that my termination had been strategic in ways I hadn't understood. Sterling's leadership hadn't fired me for performance issues. They had fired me because I knew too much about the company's capabilities and strategic value to allow their theft to proceed unnoticed. The girl from Flint who thought she had been betrayed by corporate politics was about to discover that she had actually stumbled into the middle of a criminal conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to save. The discovery of Meridian Industrial Solutions changed everything. What had seemed like corporate betrayal and career sabotage was actually something far more sinister. Robert Garrison wasn't just stealing credit for my work, he was systematically looting Sterling's most valuable assets through a network of shell companies. I needed help, but I couldn't approach this carelessly. If Garrison was willing to commit corporate fraud on this scale, he would certainly destroy anyone who threatened to expose him. I needed allies who had both the expertise to understand what was happening and the courage to act on that knowledge. My first call was to Catherine Brooks. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Sophia, I'm glad you called, but I need to be careful about what we discuss. There have been changes at Sterling since your departure." Catherine, Eva, discovered something about the Meridian Industrial Solutions partnership that you need to know. Can we meet somewhere private? There was a long pause. Tomorrow evening. Miller's Cafe on 5th Street, 7 o'clock. And Sophia? Don't discuss this with anyone else until we talk. Miller's Cafe was a small, dimly lit restaurant frequented by Wayne State University professors and local artists. Catherine was already seated in a corner booth when I arrived, looking more nervous than I had ever seen her. "Before you say anything," she began, "I need to tell you what's been happening at Sterling. 3 people have been terminated since your firing, all of them people who asked questions about your dismissal. Brian Kellerman has been given unprecedented authority over strategic partnerships. And Robert Garrison has been making decisions without board consultation that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago." I slid a folder across the table containing everything I had discovered about Meridian Industrial Solutions. Catherine's expression grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the documents. "This is worse than I imagined," she whispered. "Sophia, Meridian isn't just licensing our software. They're acquiring exclusive rights to 17 patents that Sterling has developed over the past decade. Patents that your analysis valued at over $200 million. For how much? $12 million, paid over 18 months. Catherine's voice was barely audible. "Robert structured the deal to avoid board approval by keeping each individual transaction below our governance threshold." The scope of the theft was staggering. Sterling's intellectual property, which could generate hundreds of millions in licensing revenue over the next decade, was being sold for a fraction of its value to a company that existed only on paper. "Catherine, who owns Meridian Industrial Solutions?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a document she had photographed. I managed to access the Delaware corporate filings. Meridian has 3 officers, Robert Kellner, David Morrison, and Michael Sterling. Michael Sterling. The surname was too convenient to be coincidental. "Robert Garrison has a brother named Michael," Catherine said, confirming my suspicion. "He Lives in Florida and has no connection to the manufacturing industry. But apparently, he's now a corporate officer of a company that's acquiring Sterling's most valuable assets. This wasn't just corporate fraud. It was a family enterprise designed to transfer Sterling's wealth to Robert Garrison's personal control, while leaving the company as an empty shell. We need more evidence, I said. And we need someone with legal authority who can act on what we discover. Catherine nodded. I know someone who might help. Margaret Coleman sits on Sterling's board. But she also serves on the SEC's Advisory Committee on Corporate Finance. If anyone would take this seriously, it's her. Margaret Coleman had impressed me during my board presentation with her sharp questions and obvious expertise. More importantly, as a former CEO herself, she would understand the long-term damage that Garrison's theft could inflict on Sterling's future. Catherine arranged a meeting for the following evening at Margaret's home in Grosse Pointe. The house was elegant but not ostentatious, reflecting the understated confidence of someone who had achieved success through competence rather than connections. Margaret listened without interruption as I presented everything we had discovered about Meridian Industrial Solutions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. Sophia, what you're describing is securities fraud on a massive scale. If Robert is transferring Sterling's assets to entities he controls, he's stealing from shareholders and potentially violating federal criminal statutes. What can we do? Catherine asked. We need irrefutable evidence of Robert's connection to Meridian, and we need documentation showing that he knew the intellectual property was being undervalued. Without that, this could be dismissed as poor business judgment rather than criminal intent. Margaret explained that corporate executives had significant latitude in making strategic decisions, even decisions that proved to be mistakes. Proving criminal fraud required demonstrating both intent to deceive and personal benefit from the deception. However, she continued, I have contacts at the SEC who specialize in corporate fraud investigations. If we can provide them with sufficient evidence, they have resources to uncover information that we can't access through public records. Over the next week, we developed a systematic approach to gathering evidence. Catherine would monitor Sterling's internal communications and financial transactions through her CFO access. Margaret would research Meridian's corporate structure through her SEC connections. I would analyze Sterling's public filings to identify patterns that might reveal the scope of the fraud. What we discovered was more extensive than any of us had anticipated. Meridian Industrial Solutions was just one of 4 shell companies that had been incorporated in Delaware over the past 6 months. The other 3 were Aurora Technology Partners, Precision Manufacturing Solutions, and Advanced Industrial Systems. All 4 companies shared the same registered address, the same incorporation attorney, and similar corporate officers. More damning, Sterling had entered into strategic partnerships with all 4 companies, transferring different aspects of the intellectual property portfolio I had identified during my restructuring analysis. The total value being transferred was approximately $340 million in assets for less than $25 million in payments spread over 2 years. Catherine's investigation revealed that these deals were being structured to avoid board oversight through a loophole in Sterling's governance policies. Individual transactions below $15 million could be approved by the CEO without board consultation, provided they were categorized as operational partnerships rather than asset sales. Robert Garrison was systematically dividing Sterling's most valuable assets into chunks small enough to steal without triggering governance reviews, but we still needed proof of his personal connection to the shell companies. That breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rachel Martinez called me 3 weeks into our investigation, her voice shaking with excitement and fear. Sophia, I found something, but I'm scared about what it means. Can you meet me tonight? We met at a 24-hour diner near the Detroit River, far from Sterling's headquarters and anyone who might recognize us. Rachel looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. I've been working on the Aurora Technology Partnership documentation, she began, and I noticed something strange about the payment instructions. The wire transfer details didn't match Aurora's corporate bank account information. She pulled out a folder of financial documents. Look at this. Sterling is sending payments to Aurora Technology Partners, but the receiving bank account is registered to Morrison Holdings, LLC. I researched Morrison Holdings, and it's another shell company controlled by David Morrison, the same David Morrison who's an officer of Meridian Industrial Solutions. This was the smoking gun we needed. Sterling wasn't just doing business with legitimate companies that happened to be newly incorporated. Sterling was sending money directly to entities controlled by Robert Garrison's associates, who were then presumably distributing the funds according to their private arrangements. There's more, Rachel continued. I found travel records showing that Robert Garrison has made 6 trips to the Cayman Islands over the past 4 months. The trips are listed as business development, but Sterling has no operations or customers in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands were famous for banking secrecy and offshore financial services. If Garrison was making regular trips there, while simultaneously transferring Sterling's assets to shell companies, the implication was clear: he was establishing offshore accounts to hide the stolen money. Rachel, I said carefully, you realize that what you've discovered could send Robert Garrison to federal prison for decades? She nodded grimly. I also realize that if he finds out what I know, I'll be fired immediately and probably sued for violating confidentiality agreements. But Sophia, I can't let him destroy Sterling. Too many people depend on this company. We now had evidence of corporate fraud, money laundering, and potentially criminal conspiracy. But we also had a problem: all three of us were current or former Sterling employees who could be dismissed as disgruntled workers seeking revenge against management. That's when Margaret Coleman suggested bringing in outside expertise that could provide independent validation of our findings. I know a forensic accountant in Chicago who specializes in corporate fraud investigations, she said during our next meeting. Dr. Jennifer Walsh worked for the FBI's white-collar crime unit before starting her own consulting firm. If she confirms our analysis, it would carry significant weight with federal investigators. Dr. Walsh reviewed our evidence over 2 intensive days, applying forensic accounting techniques that revealed patterns we had missed. Her analysis confirmed that Sterling's intellectual property was being systematically transferred to shell companies controlled by Robert Garrison's associates. More importantly, she identified additional red flags that suggested the fraud was even more extensive than we had realized. These shell companies aren't just acquiring Sterling's intellectual property, Dr. Walsh explained. They're also being positioned to compete directly with Sterling in the renewable energy and electric vehicle markets that Sophia's strategic plan identified as high-growth opportunities. The ultimate goal wasn't just stealing Sterling's assets. Garrison was planning to use those stolen assets to launch competing companies that would capture the market opportunities my analysis had identified, leaving Sterling as a hollowed-out shell competing against businesses built with its own intellectual property. How long do we have before this becomes irreversible? I asked. Dr. Walsh studied the timeline of asset transfers and corporate filings. Based on the current pace of transactions, I estimate that Robert Garrison will complete the transfer of Sterling's core intellectual property within 6 to 8 weeks. After that, reversing the damage would be extremely difficult, even with successful criminal prosecution. We had perhaps 2 months to expose the fraud and stop the theft before Sterling's transformation into a technology leader became impossible. The company I had saved from bankruptcy was being systematically dismantled by the CEO who had taken credit for saving it, but now we had evidence, allies, and expert validation of what was happening. Most importantly, we had a plan to expose Robert Garrison's crimes in a way that would make denial impossible and justice inevitable. The girl from Flint who had been fired for performance issues was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one with nothing left to lose. Parts 6 and 7, The Strategic Confrontation and Transformation. Part 6, The Strategic Confrontation and Public Exposure. The plan we developed was audacious and risky, but it was also perfectly suited to expose Robert Garrison's crimes in the most devastating way possible. Sterling Manufacturing's annual shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, with over 800 investors, analysts, and industry representatives expected to attend. The meeting would be broadcast live to thousands more via webcast. Robert Garrison was planning to use the shareholder meeting as a victory lap, presenting Sterling's transformation as evidence of his visionary leadership. He had prepared a presentation showcasing the company's renewed profitability, strategic partnerships, and promising future and emerging markets. What he didn't know was that his presentation would become the venue for his own destruction. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had connected us with FBI Special Agent Michael Torres, who specialized in corporate fraud investigations. Agent Torres explained that federal prosecutors needed overwhelming evidence to pursue charges against corporate executives, particularly when those executives had plausible defenses about business judgment and strategic decision-making. The most powerful evidence in white-collar crime cases is often the perpetrator's own words, Agent Torres explained during our final planning meeting. If we can get Robert Garrison to make false statements about Sterling's partnerships while he knows investigators are watching, it becomes much harder for him to claim innocent mistakes. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret Coleman would use her board authority to demand a detailed presentation about Sterling's strategic partnerships during the shareholder meeting. Robert would be forced to publicly explain the Meridian deal and the other shell company transactions, believing that his carefully constructed narrative about legitimate business relationships would protect him. Meanwhile, federal investigators would be in the audience, armed with evidence showing that Robert's legitimate business partners were actually entities he controlled. When he lied about the nature of these transactions in front of 800 witnesses and a live webcast, he would be committing securities fraud in real time, but the confrontation would need to be perfectly orchestrated. Margaret would ask specific questions designed to elicit false statements. Catherine would have financial documents ready to contradict Robert's claims. I would be present as a shareholder, having purchased sterling stock with my savings specifically. To gain access to the meeting, the morning of the shareholder meeting, I woke up at 5 a.m. with my heart racing. Everything we had worked for over the past 2 months came down to the next few hours. If our plan succeeded, Robert Garrison would be exposed as a criminal and Sterling Manufacturing would be saved from systematic looting. If we failed, the evidence might be dismissed as disgruntled employee accusations, and Robert would have time to complete his theft and disappear. I dressed in my best business suit, the same one I had worn for my board presentation 6 months earlier. It seemed appropriate to wear it again on the day I would finish what I had started. Sterling's headquarters was buzzing with activity as shareholders, analysts, and reporters filed into the main auditorium. The same room where I had presented my strategic plan was now filled with people who would witness either justice or the triumph of corporate corruption. Robert Garrison looked confident and relaxed as he took the stage, wearing an expensive suit and radiating the authority of someone who believed himself untouchable. His opening remarks focused on Sterling's remarkable transformation from near bankruptcy to industry leadership in just 6 months. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "Sterling Manufacturing has not merely survived the challenges that threatened our existence. We have emerged stronger, more innovative, and better positioned for growth than at any time in our company's history." He clicked through slides showing Sterling's improved financial metrics, growing customer base, and expanding market opportunities. Everything he presented was accurate, but he was taking credit for achievements that had required my analysis and recommendations to accomplish. Most significantly, Robert continued, "We have established strategic partnerships that will accelerate our entry into high-growth markets while generating substantial licensing revenue from our intellectual property portfolio." This was the moment Margaret Coleman had been waiting for. She stood up in the front row, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice cutting through the auditorium, "as a board member, I believe our shareholders deserve more detailed information about these strategic partnerships. Can you explain the specific terms of Sterling's relationship with Meridian Industrial Solutions?" Robert's confident expression flickered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Certainly, Margaret. Meridian Industrial Solutions is a dynamic technology company that recognizes the value of Sterling's innovations in predictive maintenance and automation software. They've agreed to license our technology for applications in renewable energy manufacturing, providing Sterling with upfront payments and ongoing royalties." "What is the total value of this licensing agreement?" Margaret pressed. "The initial licensing package is valued at $12 million over 18 months, with potential for additional royalties based on Meridian's success in commercializing our technology." Margaret nodded, then asked the question that would destroy him. "And can you tell our shareholders about Meridian's background and track record in industrial technology?" Robert's pause was barely perceptible, but I caught it. He was about to lie to 800 people while federal investigators recorded every word. Meridian Industrial Solutions is a well-established company with extensive experience in technology commercialization and market development. Their leadership team has deep expertise in the renewable energy sector, making them ideal partners for expanding Sterling's market presence. Every word was false. Meridian had been incorporated 6 weeks ago with no operational history, no employees, and no business activities beyond acquiring Sterling's intellectual property. Robert was committing securities fraud in real time, exactly as we had hoped. Agent Torres was sitting in the back of the auditorium, along with 2 other federal investigators I had been introduced to that morning. They were recording everything, while taking notes about specific false statements that could form the basis for criminal charges. Margaret continued her questioning, systematically exposing the contradictions in Robert's narrative about Sterling's strategic partnerships. She asked about Aurora Technology Partners, Precision Manufacturing Solutions, and Advanced Industrial Systems, forcing Robert to repeat lies about legitimate business relationships that were actually theft mechanisms. With each false statement, Robert was building the criminal case against himself, but the most devastating moment came when Margaret asked about the intellectual property valuation process. "Mr. Garrison, how did Sterling determine the appropriate licensing terms for technology that cost millions of dollars to develop?" Robert's confidence was visibly shaking now, but he was committed to his narrative. "Our valuation process was thorough and comprehensive, based on market analysis and industry standards for similar technology licensing agreements. Margaret turned to the audience. I'd like to invite someone to comment on Sterling's intellectual property valuation. Sophia Williams, the analyst who conducted Sterling's original strategic assessment, is present today as a shareholder. Perhaps she could share her perspective on the value of the technology being licensed to these partnership companies. This wasn't part of our original plan, but Margaret had created a perfect opportunity for me to present evidence publicly. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 800 pairs of eyes on me. Thank you, Margaret. During my analysis of Sterling's intellectual property portfolio, I valued the predictive maintenance software and automation patents at approximately $340 million in potential licensing revenue over 10 years. The technology being transferred to Mr. Garrison's partnership companies represents some of Sterling's most valuable innovations. The auditorium erupted in whispered conversations as shareholders processed what they had just heard. Robert's face had gone pale as he realized that his carefully constructed deception was collapsing in real time. Mr. Garrison, Margaret said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone delivering a verdict, if Sterling's intellectual property is worth $340 million in licensing potential, why are we transferring it for $25 million to companies that didn't exist 6 months ago? Robert tried to respond, but his words were incoherent. The lies he had been telling were now obviously false to everyone in the auditorium. More importantly, federal investigators had recorded him making material misstatements about Sterling's business relationships and financial transactions. Agent Torres stood up from his seat in the back of the auditorium. Robert Garrison, you are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft of corporate assets. The auditorium fell completely silent as federal agents moved toward the stage. Robert's arrest was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers, ensuring that his crimes would be public knowledge within minutes. The aftermath of Robert Garrison's arrest moved with stunning speed. Within hours, Sterling's board had called an emergency meeting to address the crisis and determine the company's immediate leadership needs. By that evening, I was sitting in the same boardroom where I had presented my strategic plan, but this time as Sterling Manufacturing's interim CEO. The transition happened so quickly that I barely had time to process what was occurring. David Mitchell, the board chairman, had called me personally that afternoon. Sophia, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and urgency, the board has voted unanimously to offer you the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Sterling needs leadership that understands both our strategic direction and the full scope of what Robert attempted to steal from us. The irony was overwhelming. 1 week ago, I was a terminated employee accused of performance failures. Now I was being asked to lead the same company that had fired me, tasked with repairing damage caused by the man who had taken credit for my work. What about the shell company transactions? I asked. Can we recover the intellectual property that's already been transferred? Margaret Coleman answered this question during the emergency board meeting. The FBI has frozen all assets connected to Meridian Industrial Solutions and the other shell companies. Federal prosecutors are confident that we can recover most, if not all, of the intellectual property through asset forfeiture proceedings. The legal process would take months, but Sterling's most valuable technology would eventually be returned to the company. More importantly, the criminal investigation had revealed additional evidence of Robert's fraud that we hadn't discovered independently. Sophia, David Mitchell said, we need to rebuild Sterling's credibility with investors, customers, and employees. We need someone who understands our transformation strategy and can execute it with integrity. Most importantly, we need leadership that will ensure nothing like this ever happens again. Accepting the CEO position was the easiest decision I had ever made. This wasn't just about my career or personal vindication. Sterling Manufacturing employed nearly 2,000 people whose livelihoods had been threatened by Robert's criminal scheme. The company my analysis had saved from bankruptcy deserved leadership that would protect its future. My first act as CEO was addressing Sterling's employees directly. I called a company-wide meeting for the next morning, standing before the same workforce that had applauded my strategic plan 6 months earlier. 6 months ago, I presented a vision for Sterling's transformation from a traditional manufacturer to a technology-enabled solutions provider. Today, I'm here as your CEO to ensure that vision becomes reality, free from the corruption that threatened to destroy everything we've built together. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The same employees who had been confused by my termination were now cheering my return as their leader. More importantly, they understood that Sterling's future was secure under leadership committed to the strategic plan we had developed together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of rebuilding and transformation. My first priority was restoring investor confidence by implementing transparency measures that would prevent future fraud. Every financial transaction above $1 million would require board approval. All strategic partnerships would be subject to independent valuation and legal review. Most importantly, Sterling would publish quarterly reports detailing our intellectual property portfolio and licensing activities. Catherine Brooks was promoted to Chief Financial Officer, a position she had earned through her courage in exposing Robert's crimes. Rachel Martinez became Director of Strategic Analysis, leading the team responsible for evaluating market opportunities and competitive threats. Kevin Thompson was appointed to head our new corporate governance division, ensuring that Sterling's transformation would be protected by robust oversight systems, but the most satisfying changes were the ones that affected Sterling's employees directly. I implemented an equity participation program that gave every worker ownership stakes in the company's success. The manufacturing employees who built our equipment, the engineers who designed it, and the sales teams who sold it would all benefit. When Sterling achieved the growth projections my original analysis had identified. 3 months into my tenure as CEO, Sterling announced our first major success since Robert's arrest, a $73 million contract to provide custom automation equipment for a solar panel manufacturing facility in California. The contract validated everything my strategic plan had predicted about opportunities in renewable energy markets. More importantly, the contract demonstrated that Sterling could compete successfully based on superior technology and service capabilities, rather than lowest-cost pricing. We were charging premium rates for solutions that our customers couldn't get from overseas competitors, exactly as I had envisioned during my original analysis. The financial results exceeded our most optimistic projections. Sterling's quarterly revenue grew by 31% year-over-year, while gross margins expanded to 39%. Our stock price had increased 127% since Robert's arrest, reflecting investor confidence in Sterling's transformation under new leadership, but the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the cultural transformation that had occurred. At Sterling, employees who had felt disconnected from the company's strategic direction were now enthusiastic participants in our growth. Engineers who had been undervalued were developing innovative solutions that customers eagerly purchased. Sales representatives who had struggled to compete on price were successfully selling premium services. Most significantly, Sterling had become a model for corporate governance and ethical leadership. Business schools were teaching case studies about our transformation. Industry publications featured Sterling as an example of how companies could prevent executive fraud through transparency and employee empowerment. 6 months after becoming CEO, I received a call that brought everything full circle. It was from Maria Santos, a young financial analyst at a manufacturing company in Ohio who had discovered her CEO was embezzling company funds. "Ms. Williams," she said, her voice shaking with nervousness and determination, "I read about what happened at Sterling Manufacturing. I think my boss is stealing money, but I'm scared about what will happen if I report it. Can you help me?" The conversation lasted 2 hours as I walked Maria through the process of documenting evidence, protecting herself legally, and contacting appropriate authorities. By the end of our call, she had the confidence and knowledge to expose corporate fraud at her own company. 2 weeks later, Maria's CEO was arrested for embezzling $4.2 million in company funds. Maria was promoted to Chief Financial Officer and credited with saving her company from financial collapse. Her story became another example of how individual courage could defeat corporate corruption. That evening, as I sat in my corner office, looking out at the Detroit skyline, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from terminated employee to CEO in just 7 months. The girl from Flint who had been fired for performance issues was now running a billion-dollar company and inspiring other young professionals to fight against corporate wrongdoing. My phone buzzed with a text message from my parents, who had driven down from Flint to attend Sterling's annual employee appreciation dinner. "We're so proud of the woman you've become," the message read. "You didn't just save a company. You showed everyone that doing the right thing is always worth fighting for." Sterling Manufacturing's transformation was complete, but it was also just beginning. We had proven that companies could compete successfully while maintaining the highest ethical standards. We had demonstrated that transparency and accountability created value rather than limiting it. Most importantly, we had shown that sometimes the person who seems most powerless turns out to be the most dangerous threat to those who abuse their authority. Robert Garrison was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison for securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The judge called his crimes a betrayal of every employee, shareholder, and customer who trusted Sterling Manufacturing with their investments and livelihoods. Meanwhile, Sterling Manufacturing continued growing, innovating, and creating value for all stakeholders. The company that had nearly been destroyed by executive greed became a testament to what was possible when leadership prioritized long-term success over short-term enrichment. My name is Sophia Williams. I'm 29 years old, the CEO of Sterling Manufacturing, and living proof that sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to your career. The email that was meant to end my involvement with Sterling actually launched my transformation from analyst to leader, from victim to champion of corporate justice. The girl who was terminated for saving a company from bankruptcy ultimately took the CEO's seat not through political maneuvering or corporate connections, but by refusing to let corruption triumph over integrity. And that, as it turned out, made all the difference in the world. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.